Yo, what's up, chefs? It's Vinny, and as I'm sure many of you know, the new league Dawn of the Hunt, or 0.2.0, is right around the corner. With that in mind, I decided to create a 4-part series that is going to get you fully prepared to have a successful league start. I'll be rolling out videos for this series in the days leading up to April 2nd, and of course, we are kicking it off today with my top 5 league starter builds. I'll also be including multiple links to detailed and beginner-friendly guides for each of the builds I discussed today down in the description below. So without further ado, let's get started. Coming in at the number 5 spot, we have the Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder. And let me just briefly say that there were multiple contenders for the 5th slot, but ultimately this build is just so incredibly league start friendly that I had to give it to Poisonous Concoction. It's super simple to get this build online, primarily just requiring some plus levels of projectile skills coming from your amulet, quiver, and bow to boost up your damage, with the eventual plan to transition into a nicely corrupted Widowhail and God Quiver to really scale your damage for deep endgame content. Not to mention, you'll also be getting your 6-link concoction for free upon hitting level 90, which is super nice. You also have access to some of the best evasion and energy shield nodes on the entire tree, so it'll be very easy to get incredibly tanky with a hybrid EV/ES setup. The build just naturally does really high boss DPS, and their map clear is also decently solid thanks to the Ascendancy node that automatically spreads your poison. Finally, since this build does not rely on double heralds and isn't blatantly overpowered in the current meta, I find it very unlikely that it will receive any nerfs in 0.2. Coming in at number 4, we have the Lightning Arrow Deadeye, and yes, before you say it, I think even with the expected nerfs to double heralds that we all know are coming, this build would still land in my number 4 spot. I've played both Lightning Arrow and Ice Shot Deadeye this league, and the footage in the background is actually me running a T15 6-mod Delirious map with Herald of Ice turned off. And it's obviously worse than when it's turned on and literally causing the entire screen to explode, but it still allowed me to just glide right through the map, and this character is even on a quite low budget. With that out of the way though, this build is just very strong. Lightning Arrow has been a long time staple POE skill for a reason. Mechanically, the way it clears and just automatically chains to all nearby enemies is quite satisfying to play with. Not only that, but the interaction between Orb of Storms and Lightning Rod creates massive boss DPS, and similarly to the Pathfinder, you'll still have access to all of the insane evasion and energy shield nodes in the passive tree, allowing you to be incredibly tanky with a hybrid EV/ES setup. Eventually in the endgame, you can look to transition towards things like Cast on Shock with Ball Lightning and a Melting Maelstrom Mana Flask for even more boss DPS. You can get Breach Rings plus an Ingenuity, and finally even ramping up your crit chance and crit bonus to scale your damage to the next level. Moving on and taking home the number 3 spot is going to be the Ice Strike Invoker. Many of you that have been watching the channel probably remember my triple element version of the build, which actually ended up being used by many monks, including even the rank 1 monk in the POE 2 races that took place recently, and for good reason. Similarly to the Ranger, I think even with the expected nerfs to double heralds, this build would still land in my number 3 spot, that the only way we'd really see it, or even the Lightning Arrow Deadeye for that matter, kicked out of the top 5 is if we also see significant buffs to a plethora of other builds in the game at the same time, which is certainly possible, of course. With that being said though, this build is an absolute powerhouse and shines in a lot of the same ways that LA Deadeye does, and even though it's undoubtedly slower than the Deadeye, it ultimately pulls ahead due to just how easy it is to gear, how tanky it gets, and how incredibly strong it is throughout the campaign and early endgame, even on a very low budget. Most of this strength comes from these 2 Ascendancy nodes. Protect Me from Harm is less optimal as you start to get more gear, but I still believe in a league start position that it will be quite good, and Lead Me Through Grace just makes getting your spirit up and persistent buffs online so much easier. It's also worth noting that the Monk has a slightly more optimal starting position on the passive tree than the Ranger, in my opinion, giving it an easier time picking up the most optimal combination of defensive, offensive, and crit related nodes that this area of the tree has to offer. And finally, since you are making use of Ice Strike, which is an amazing skill, you'll be freezing everything you come in contact with, which is a pretty underrated defensive layer and makes bossing much easier as well. Next up, coming in at the number 2 spot, we have a personal favorite of mine from the first season, so I might be a little bit biased, but it is the Spark Stormweaver. Now, there is an argument to be made that this build should actually be lower on the list compared to Ice Strike Invoker and Lightning Arrow Deadeye due to its increased complexity and difficulty to gear, but I'm making an estimated guess that the balance changes we see in 0.2 will end up actually hitting those other builds quite a bit harder than Spark. So that's just something for you to keep in mind. With that being said, if you happen to resonate more with a caster build at heart, and you're not opposed to playing something a little more complex, then this would be perfect for you. Spark Stormweaver, in my opinion, is one of the best all-around builds in the entire game, and outside of feeling a tiny bit weak right when you first get into maps and have no gear, it just doesn't have many weaknesses to make note of. It's got amazing clear speed, it competes for the highest boss DPS in the game, not including any bugged interactions, it has complicated but very potent defensive layers, and even has decent mobility. Throughout the campaign and early endgame, you'll be able to make quick work of most enemies by just utilizing Spark, Flame Wall, and Archmage. And eventually you have the option to transition into also getting cast on Shock with Lightning Conduit to kill bosses in under a second when combined with high magnitude double shocks from your Ascendancy and very high lightning exposure. For defense, you'll be starting out going pretty much all in on just maxing out your energy shield, but as you start to get a little bit more gear in the end game, you can move towards a Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery, and Chaos Inoculation setup, which, when configured effectively, makes you feel nearly immortal. Finally, I know there are probably some people saying that this build is not that budget friendly, but I just happen to think that it's not nearly as bad as people give it credit for, especially if you opt to go for a non-crit setup as opposed to one that focuses on crit. You can actually save yourself countless divines during the gearing process while still being nearly just as strong. Before we get on to our number 1 spot, I do have an honorable mention that I thought I should touch on briefly and at least deserve to be on the list somewhere, and that is the Stat Stacker Gemling Legionnaire. Now I know that half of you were probably thinking this would be the number 1 spot because it was arguably the most broken non-temporalis build in the game, and the other half of you are thinking, why is this build even on the tier list at all? Because it's so incredibly expensive to set up and does not operate well within a league start environment. And I tend to agree with both of these points, hence why it ended up as an honorable mention. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for this build, but assuming it doesn't get nerfed completely into the ground, I think it would honestly not be a bad choice at all, with the caveat that you need to be an experienced player that either knows how to make the build work on a very low budget early into the league, or you have to have a plan to use a different build up until you can afford to swap over to a full stat stacker setup. And finally, coming in at the number 1 spot, we have the Minions Infernalist. And what can I say? This build is just insane all around. Particularly if you are a less experienced player, it is genuinely hard to go wrong with Minions Infernalist. It is arguably one of the easiest builds in the game to understand how to scale your damage. It doesn't rely on a bunch of different offensive stats, which makes getting resistances and luxury stats like increased rarity of items found extremely simple. And finally, the Infernalist Ascendancy combined with the starting position on the passive tree allows you to achieve actual overkill levels of tankiness without breaking the bank. there really isn't much that comes to mind for downsides of this build, other than if you just don't enjoy the minion playstyle that allows you to go AFK during most content, or if you are dead set, like really dead set, on primarily just farming waystones for currency, because this build isn't quite up to par with Spark or LA Deadeye for waystone efficiency. However, thankfully you can eventually work Blink even into this minion setup, and at that point there is a plethora of highly profitable content for you to participate in outside of just waystones, such as Trial of Secamus, Trial of Chaos, Simulacrum, and really all of the Pinnacle encounters, which arguably are all just as good or even better in some cases than farming Delirious plus Breach Waystones or whatever league mechanic you prefer to put on your Atlas. For the campaign, I'd recommend running Arsonist plus SRS, and as you move into the endgame, you can transition towards using Storm Mages just to apply your shock, plus Frost Mages for your damage and freeze, or you can just go all out with your Storm Mages, having some for just shocking and some for damage is also a fine choice. And that is going to conclude my top 5 builds list for League Start. I hope you guys enjoyed, and make sure to stay tuned on the days leading up to April 4th for the rest of the League Start Survival Guide series, and I'll also be live streaming on YouTube and Twitch nearly every day starting on April 4th. We have one of the friendliest and most helpful POE 2 communities, so it's always a good time, and you're always welcome to hop in and just ask some questions if you want to. If you agreed or disagreed with my rankings in this list, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe, and other than that, I will be seeing all of you on April 4th for 0.2. And last but not least, take it easy, chefs. As you fade away, as you fade away.